It was supposed to be the happiest night of my marriage, candles, roses, and a promise to love each other forever. But before the appetizers even arrived, my husband's pregnant mistress sat down at our table and told me his billionaire mother was thrilled about the baby. That's when I realized this wasn't just betrayal. It was a plan to erase me from his life completely. The clink of crystal glasses and low hum of laughter floated through the dining room of London's most exclusive restaurant. I remember the smell first, roses, deep and sweet, arranged in a bouquet that waited for me at the center of our table. Michael had chosen them, tied with a ribbon in my favorite color. For 8 years, I had been his wife. For 4 of those years, I had been his partner in the exhausting, hopeful, heartbreaking journey to have a child. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of our love, the one thing I believed was unshakable. He looked handsome in the tailored navy suit I'd given him for his last birthday. His smile, when I sat down, was warm but oddly restrained. I thought maybe he was nervous about the surprise he had planned. The waiter poured champagne, the soft golden light from the chandelier catching in the bubbles. And then I saw her. Clara, Michael's executive assistant. 2 years in his office, countless late nights, weekend site visits, and business dinners I'd convinced myself were just part of the job. She walked toward us in a silk dress, smiling as if she belonged there. I frowned, certain this was some sort of mistake. But before I could speak, she pulled a slim envelope from her bag and slid it across the table toward me. Inside was a grainy black and white image. It took me a moment to realize what I was holding, a sonogram. "Congratulations, Danielle," she said in a voice that dripped with politeness but glinted with something sharper. "You're going to be an aunt. Michael and I are expecting." The air left my lungs. My ears filled with the roar of rushing blood. My first thought was that she was lying, some cruel prank. But when I turned to Michael, his gaze was fixed on the table. He didn't deny it. He didn't even look at me. Clara kept talking, her tone light, like she was discussing the weather. She mentioned that Margaret, Michael's mother, was thrilled about the baby. That she thought it was the best thing for the family's future. Margaret. The woman who had scrutinized me from the day we met. Who had reminded me at every holiday dinner about carrying on the family name. Who had smiled politely at charity events while making sure I overheard her telling friends I was lovely, but not quite the right fit. I felt my stomach twist. This wasn't just a fling. This was sanctioned. Planned. Michael finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. 8 months. 8 months. While I was swallowing fertility pills and marking ovulation dates, he was starting a family with someone else. While I was crying over another negative test, he was celebrating positive ones in secret. The candles flickered between us, but the warmth was gone. I saw Margaret's fingerprints all over this, the timing, the secrecy, the smugness in Clara's smile. This wasn't an accident. It was a replacement. I pushed back my chair. The roses blurred in my vision as I walked past the staring diners. My heels clicked against the marble floor, each step harder than the last. Outside, the night air was cold, cutting through the fog in my head. Somewhere inside that restaurant, Michael and Clara were probably explaining my reaction to Margaret over the phone. They thought I was gone, humiliated, defeated. But standing on that dark London street, my breath clouding in the air, I realized something. They had just made the mistake of underestimating me. The cold air outside that restaurant was like a slap to my senses, but it wasn't enough to clear the storm inside my head. My phone buzzed in my hand, Michael's name flashing on the screen, and I pressed the power button until it went black. I wasn't ready to hear excuses. I wasn't ready to hear him say this wasn't about love but about legacy. I went home, packed a small overnight bag, and drove to a modest boutique hotel across town. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I wanted silence, space, and the ability to think without Margaret's shadow hanging over me. For 2 days, I stayed quiet. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I replayed every conversation, every business trip, every moment that now felt like a piece of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was solving. And each time, my thoughts landed on the same person, Margaret. She was the kind of woman who could host a charity gala in the evening and quietly ruin someone's career the next morning without smudging her lipstick. In the 8 years I'd been married to Michael, she'd made it clear that everything was about the family name, the company, and the dynasty she believed she was protecting. The problem was, Margaret didn't just think I wasn't enough, she thought I was in the way. On the 3rd morning, I called Renee. We'd been friends since university. Where I was patient and diplomatic, she was sharp, fearless, and allergic to injustice. When she answered, I told her everything, from Clara's arrival at the anniversary dinner to Michael's 8-month confession. There was silence for a moment before Renee spoke. If Margaret's backing this, it's not just about a baby. It's business. She's positioning the company for something big, and you're being removed. I wanted to argue, to believe this was about personal betrayal, but deep down I knew she was right. Margaret didn't waste time on emotions, she made moves like a chess master. Clara's pregnancy wasn't just an affair. It was a calculated play. Renee told me to start looking at our finances. I hesitated. Michael had always handled the accounts, something I'd once considered an act of trust. But that night, I went into his study. I pulled open the filing drawers, flipping through property deeds and account statements. My stomach dropped. Properties that had been jointly owned now bore only Michael's name. Joint bank accounts had been split and transferred. The dates weren't random, they were recent, all within the past year. The exact year Clara had started working late nights. And then I saw it, Margaret's signature on several transfer authorizations. I kept digging, moving to the bottom drawer where Michael stored older files. That's when I found printed emails between Margaret and our fertility specialist. Reading them felt like swallowing ice. Margaret had written that she suggested Danielle and Michael pause treatments for a while to let nature take its course. The same month, Michael's travel schedule with Clara had doubled. I sat there in his leather chair, the edges of the paper trembling in my hands. It wasn't just betrayal, it was sabotage. They'd weaponized my pain, my hope, and my trust. That night, I called Renee again. My voice didn't shake this time. If they think I'm walking away quietly, they've made the biggest mistake of their lives. Renee's reply was calm but electric. Good. Because I have someone inside that company who's been waiting for the right time to bring Margaret down. And they've got the kind of evidence that doesn't just ruin reputations, it destroys empires. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was the quiet hum of a plan beginning to form. From the moment Renee mentioned her contact inside the company, my focus sharpened. This wasn't just about exposing an affair, it was about dismantling the carefully built tower Margaret had been stacking over my head for years. 2 days later, I met Renee's source in the corner booth of a small cafe far from the city center. He was the company's senior financial officer, discreet, precise, and visibly nervous. Over the course of an hour, he slid a series of USB drives across the table, each containing files that could, in his words, burn the house down. That night, in the dim light of my hotel room, I opened the first drive. What I found was staggering. Inflated property valuations to secure bigger loans, under-the-table payments to council members for zoning approvals, and contracts handed to Clara's family's firm without competitive bidding, all signed off by Margaret. The deeper I went, the more I understood that Clara's pregnancy was only part of a much bigger picture. This was about securing a merger between Michael's empire and Clara's family's struggling construction business. The baby wasn't just a child, it was leverage. 4 hours, I pieced together the pattern. Margaret had been quietly transferring assets, securing alliances, and clearing obstacles, and I had been her biggest obstacle. Then, in a folder marked Strategic Partnerships, I found the document that made my blood run cold, an internal memo detailing the agenda for the upcoming Legacy Gala. The gala was Margaret's crown jewel, an annual event attended by the most influential developers, politicians, and financiers in the country. She used it to announce major deals, new projects, and family milestones. And according to the memo, this year's headline announcement would be the engagement of Michael and Clara, alongside the official merger of the two family companies. My name wasn't just absent. It had been erased, as though I'd never existed in Michael's life. I sat back, staring at the screen. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the minibar fridge. My hands curled into fists. I realized this wasn't simply about replacing me, it was about rewriting history. In their new version of events, Michael was the devoted fiancé, Clara was the future matriarch, and Margaret had orchestrated the perfect alliance to secure the family's legacy. They planned to unveil it all at the gala, complete with glossy photographs and speeches about family values. The thought of standing on the sidelines while they toasted to my erasure made my chest tighten, but only for a moment. Then, something inside me shifted. I didn't want to stop the gala. I wanted to stand in the middle of it. I wanted Margaret to see me walk into that ballroom, alive, composed, and holding the truth like a blade. I wanted Michael to watch every carefully chosen word of his new life crumble under the weight of his own choices. I wanted Clara to realize she hadn't been chosen out of love, but because she was useful, until she wasn't. For years, I had played by their rules, hoping my loyalty would earn me respect. Now, I was done playing. The next morning, I called a tailor. I ordered a gown in deep emerald, the color Margaret had once called too bold for a woman in my position. I chose it deliberately, a signal that I wasn't hiding in shadows anymore. And as the tailor took my measurements, I pictured it. The chandeliers, the crowd, the moment Margaret's smile would falter as she realized I hadn't disappeared at all. I wasn't just coming to the gala. I was bringing the match that would burn their empire to the ground. If Margaret thought she was the only one capable of playing the long game, she was about to learn otherwise. The emerald gown was just the armor. The real battle would be fought in the weeks before the gala, and every move had to be precise. The first step was Clara's father. He was a man with a reputation for pride and caution, the kind of businessman who would rather walk away from a deal than risk being made a fool. Using an untraceable email account, I sent him excerpts from the company's internal records, not enough to identify me, but enough to suggest that the property valuations Michael's firm had provided were optimistic. 2 days later, I followed it up with a discreet phone call, posing as a concerned industry contact. I hinted at inconsistencies in the company's land registry filings, suggesting it might be wise for him to double-check the financial guarantees in the merger agreement. I could practically hear him frowning on the other end of the line. Next were the long-standing partners of Michael's company, men and women who had dined at our table, sent Christmas cards, and toasted our wedding. I invited 2 of them for coffee, smiling politely as if this was nothing more than a casual catch-up. But between the sips and small talk, I slid them small packets of photocopied contracts and unexplained wire transfers. "I'm sure it's nothing," I'd say lightly, "but you might want to look into it." By the time we parted, both of them had the cautious, calculating look of people who were already asking themselves uncomfortable questions. The real weapon, however, was the insider Renee had connected me with. Every few days, another USB drive would arrive, filled with damning evidence. Payments to city officials for expedited permits. Land acquisition deals with missing signatures. Loan applications that looked polished until you noticed the valuation reports were written by firms tied directly to Margaret's personal friends. I organized everything into a clean, chronological timeline. I knew the type of people who attended Margaret's gala. They liked their scandals presented neatly, with no loose ends. But I also knew evidence wasn't enough. I needed impact. So, I made one more move. A week before the gala, I bumped into an old acquaintance, a society columnist with a nose for drama. Over lunch, I mentioned, purely hypothetically, how devastating it would be if someone were to expose fraud at a high-profile event. I let her imagination do the rest. By now, the tension inside me had shifted. The pain of betrayal was still there, but it had transformed into a cold, steady focus. Every email, every phone call, every careful leak was a brick in the wall closing in on Margaret. And still, I kept up appearances. I attended a charity luncheon, wearing a smile so serene it made Margaret's friends believe I'd moved on. I posted nothing, said nothing, disappeared from the social pages entirely. Let them believe I was licking my wounds. The quieter I appeared, the harder the impact would be. The night before the gala, I laid out the emerald gown. Its deep green shimmered in the lamplight, the fabric cool under my fingertips. Tomorrow, I wouldn't just walk into that ballroom. I would own it. Margaret believed she was hosting a celebration of her power, her vision, her perfect future for the family. But I knew the truth. Tomorrow night, she'd be hosting her own undoing. The night of the gala arrived with the kind of chill that makes the air feel sharper. The Royal Corinthian ballroom glowed like a palace, every window spilling golden light into the winter darkness. Inside, chandeliers dripped crystal over marble floors, and the scent of expensive perfume hung in the air. It was the kind of place where reputations were cemented or destroyed. I stepped from the car slowly, letting the hem of my emerald gown catch the light. Conversations at the entrance faltered as people turned. The woman they'd been told was away for her health was standing right there, chin high, eyes steady. I didn't rush. Let them take in every detail. Let them whisper. Inside, the room was already thick with champagne and anticipation. Politicians, developers, and society figures floated between tables set with silver chargers and arrangements of white orchids. At the far end, the stage was framed by tall banners bearing the family crest. And there, Center stage was Margaret, radiant in a navy gown, greeting guests as if she owned the air itself. Michael stood beside her, expression tight. Clara, in a champagne silk dress that clung to her 8-month belly, looked both smug and uncomfortable under the weight of all the attention. Her hand rested protectively on her stomach, as if the child inside were her crown. I moved through the crowd like water, greeting a few acquaintances with polite nods. The partners I'd quietly warned weeks ago watched me closely, their eyes sharp with unspoken questions. Margaret's gaze finally found mine. For a fraction of a second, her smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. She gave a gracious nod, as if my presence were an amusing surprise rather than an intrusion. Dinner passed in a blur of polite conversation and rehearsed laughter. I barely tasted the food. My focus was on the stage, on the speeches that would follow, on the moment I'd been building toward. When the dessert plates were cleared, Margaret stepped up to the podium. Her voice was warm, confident, practiced. She spoke about family values, about building a future worthy of our past. She thanked partners and honored the strength of alliances that would carry the company into a new era. And then she began to lead into it, the announcement of Michael and Clara's engagement and the merger. That was my cue. I stood, the silk of my gown whispering against the floor, and walked toward the stage. Heads turned, murmurs rose. Margaret hesitated mid-sentence, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Before you make your announcement," I said evenly, "you might want to share the truth with your guests." I nodded toward the AV booth, where Renee waited. The screens behind Margaret flickered, then lit up with the first slide, scanned contracts showing inflated property valuations. Another click, email exchanges between Margaret and city officials discussing payments for expedited permits. Then, internal memos about transferring assets to avoid tax scrutiny. The crowd's murmur swelled into a wave. Finally, the recording. Margaret's voice, unmistakable, cool as ice. "Danielle was never the right fit for this family. Clara represents the future we need, and we'll remove Danielle from the trust quietly." Gasps broke across the room. Clara's father rose from his seat, his face hard. Without a word, he and his wife walked out, taking the merger with them. Margaret tried to speak, but the noise of the room drowned her. Investors were already pulling out their phones, whispering urgently. A councilman I recognized from the document stared at the screen like it was a guillotine. I didn't need to stay for the rest. I'd come for one thing, to make sure they could never rewrite my story. And judging by the chaos erupting behind me as I left, the first chapter of their downfall had just been written. The morning after the gala, the headlines hit like a hammer. Legacy Gala turns to scandal blared across financial papers, while society columns dissected every whispered detail of the night. Photographs of the projection screen. My evidence, Margaret's words, the frozen faces of Michael and Clara, were everywhere. The damage was immediate. Several key investors withdrew within 48 hours, issuing carefully worded statements about maintaining ethical standards. The council members caught in my evidence scrambled to distance themselves, claiming they had been misled. Bank loans Margaret had relied on for ongoing projects were called in early. By the end of the week, the company's shares had plummeted. Contracts were suspended, mergers dead in the water. Even the family's oldest allies, the ones who had sat at their table for decades, stopped returning calls. Margaret tried to spin the story, calling it family drama blown out of proportion, but the documents I'd released weren't rumors. They were facts. The investigations began almost immediately. Fraud, bribery, asset misappropriation. Michael reached out 3 times. The first message was clipped and defensive, "We need to talk." The second, more desperate, "You've made your point. Can we fix this?" By the third, his tone had shifted entirely. "I'm sorry. Please. I've lost everything." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. His silence at that anniversary dinner had been his choice. His complicity in every signature, every transfer, had been his choice. The man I'd once thought was my partner had chosen comfort over courage, and now he was standing in the ruins he'd helped build. Clara vanished from public view within a month. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that she'd moved back to her parents' estate, the pregnancy now shrouded in privacy. Without the merger, her father's company couldn't recover from its financial slump. Margaret had promised her a crown, but all she got was a scandal. The divorce was swift. With Renee's legal expertise and the weight of documented financial misconduct, I walked away with a fair settlement, plus damages. Enough to start again without looking over my shoulder. I didn't waste it. I invested in a small but growing consultancy that specialized in helping women protect their financial interests during divorce. My first clients were hesitant, unsure. By the end of their cases, they were walking away with their heads high. Every time, I thought of Margaret, and smiled. 6 months later, the property empire that had once seemed untouchable was gone. Liquidated to pay debts, its name now whispered in the industry not as a mark of prestige, but as a cautionary tale. Margaret was still fighting lawsuits, her once spotless social calendar now empty. One spring afternoon, I walked past the Royal Corinthian Ballroom on my way to meet a client. The banners from last year's gala were long gone, replaced by the name of a new developer hosting their own celebration. I paused for a moment, remembering the chandeliers, the gasps, the way Margaret's face had shifted from smug confidence to cold panic in seconds. I didn't regret a single thing. Betrayal had nearly broken me, but it had also sharpened me. I had learned to read between the lines, to see the moves before they were made, and to trust my own instincts above all else. The woman who had walked into that anniversary dinner had been patient, hopeful, and willing to believe the best in people. The woman who walked away from the gala was something else entirely, stronger, sharper, and unwilling to let anyone write her out of her own story. And as I stepped into the afternoon sun, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I had not just survived them. I had ended them. If this story hit you like it hit me, make sure you hit that like button and share it with someone who believes in standing up for themselves. Subscribe so you don't miss the next real-life story of betrayal and revenge. And tell me in the comments, if you were in her place, would you have exposed them in public, or taken them down quietly behind the scenes?